A flight full of passengers turns into a tense standoff when a racist passenger insults a flight attendant, but the captain refuses to take off until an apology is made. What happens next will change everything you thought you knew about standing up for what's right. Subscribe and stick around to see how this shocking story ends. It was supposed to be an ordinary flight, the kind where you buckle in, relax, and let the world fade away for a few hours. But what happened next would shake everyone in that cabin to their core, leaving the passengers in stunned silence. This wasn't just another flight. This was a moment that would change everything for those on board. Her name was Jasmine Clark. She had worked as an air hostess for 3 years, always trying to make sure every passenger felt comfortable, every flight was smooth, and every moment was handled with care. She loved her job. But she didn't expect that this flight would be anything other than routine. It all started when the plane was about to take off. The passengers had boarded, the crew was preparing, and the cabin was filled with the usual pre-flight chatter. But then, one voice cut through the noise, a voice laced with anger. Jasmine had heard it before, but never quite like this. A man sitting towards the back of the plane had started to make remarks. Racist comments directed at a fellow passenger, a woman of color. The words were vile, and as much as Jasmine wanted to ignore it, she couldn't. She had heard the cruelty. The venom in his tone was impossible to miss. He wasn't just being rude, he was attacking someone for the color of their skin, something Jasmine couldn't and wouldn't stand for. At first, the other passengers remained silent. The crew continued with their checks, but Jasmine couldn't just walk away. She made her way to the back of the plane, where the man's cruel words were still floating in the air. He hadn't stopped. In fact, he seemed to be getting louder, more belligerent. And that's when Jasmine did something that shocked everyone. She walked up to him, looked him straight in the eye, and asked him to stop. But he didn't just ignore her. No, he took it further. He mocked her. He laughed in her face and made another cruel remark. But this time Jasmine wasn't backing down. She turned to the captain, standing at the front of the plane, and spoke into the intercom. "We're not taking off until that man apologizes," she said, her voice calm but firm. The whole cabin went silent. The passengers, who had been too afraid to speak up, were suddenly listening, waiting for what would happen next. The flight crew exchanged uncertain looks, unsure of how to handle the situation. But what happened next was something no one could have predicted. Captain Henry Miles, a seasoned pilot known for his calm demeanor, but with an unwavering sense of justice, walked out of the cockpit. His face was serious as he strode down the aisle. When he reached Jasmine, he didn't hesitate. He turned to the man who had been making the racist remarks, standing right in front of him. "You will apologize to this woman. You will apologize to her now," Captain Miles said, his voice steady but commanding. For a moment, the man seemed taken aback. He didn't expect the captain to step in. He wasn't used to people standing up to him. But Captain Miles wasn't just going to let this slide. Not now. Not in his cockpit. Not on his plane. "You either apologize or we're not flying," Captain Miles continued. The tension in the cabin grew, and a hush fell over everyone. The man, still defiant, looked around at the silent cabin, realizing that the situation was quickly spiraling out of his control. He knew he was now the center of attention, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. He stood up, ready to argue, but something in Captain Miles's eyes made him hesitate. The plane was still on the tarmac, the engines running, but no one was going anywhere until the situation was resolved. And that's when Captain Miles dropped the final bombshell. "If you don't apologize to this woman, if you don't show some basic decency and respect, you're off this plane." The passengers were shocked, but it was clear that Captain Miles wasn't bluffing. His words were heavy with authority, and no one had ever seen a pilot take such a strong stand. Jasmine, standing beside him, was waiting. She wasn't about to let this man go without showing some basic humanity. She didn't want him kicked off the plane. She just wanted him to see that his words had consequences. The man stood there silent now, his face turning red with frustration. Would he apologize? Would he give in to the pressure? What would happen next? The tension in the cabin was palpable. No one moved. No one spoke. The hum of the plane's engines was the only sound breaking the silence. Jasmine stood still, her heart pounding, but her expression unwavering. She wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to let this man's ignorance slide, not today, and neither was Captain Miles. The man shifted in his seat, looking around at the silent passengers, realizing that he had no escape. His defiance wavered. He was trapped. Either he would apologize, or he would face the humiliation of being escorted off the plane. The faces of the other passengers said it all. There was no backing down now. Everyone was watching him, waiting for him to do the right thing. Captain Miles remained calm, his eyes never leaving the man's. "This is your last chance," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Apologize now, or we'll find someone who will." The man opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. He could feel the eyes of every passenger on him, their judgment heavy in the air. For a moment, he looked like he might speak, maybe throw out some excuse, or even lash out in anger. But then, something unexpected happened. He slumped in his seat, his shoulders drooping as the weight of the moment hit him. He realized he had no more cards to play. The pride, the arrogance, everything that had kept him defiant, was fading. Slowly, he looked up at Jasmine, his eyes flicking with an emotion that wasn't anger, but something else. Maybe regret, maybe shame, but it was enough. "I'm sorry," he muttered, barely above a whisper. It wasn't much. It wasn't the heartfelt apology Jasmine had hoped for. But it was something. It was enough for Captain Miles, who gave a single nod before turning back toward the cockpit. The cabin, which had been so silent, suddenly erupted with a low murmur. People were talking, exchanging looks, but no one spoke loudly enough to break the tension completely. It wasn't the victory Jasmine had imagined, but it was a small win, a start. But the real victory came not in the apology, but in the courage of one person standing up, one voice that broke the silence and made the whole cabin reflect on what was happening. As the man muttered his apology, Jasmine's heart began to slow, the adrenaline fading away. She knew this wasn't over. This moment was just the beginning. The flight wasn't just a trip to a destination anymore. It was a symbol of something bigger, something that needed to be said, something that needed to change. Captain Miles returned to the cockpit, and the crew resumed their duties. The plane began to taxi down the runway, finally preparing for takeoff. But Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't the same anymore. What had just happened was a turning point, not just for the man who had made those remarks, but for everyone on that flight. As the plane soared into the sky, Jasmine sat back in her seat, staring out the window. Her thoughts raced. Was the apology enough? Was it truly genuine? Was this moment going to change anything long-term? She didn't know. But what she did know was this: she had made a stand. She had refused to stay silent in the face of racism and cruelty, and that was something. The rest of the flight passed without incident, but Jasmine kept replaying the moment in her mind. It had been a simple apology, but to her, it meant everything. It wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about the man. It was about everyone who had ever been hurt by words, who had ever felt belittled or less than because of their race, their appearance, or their background. Jasmine realized that this was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. It was a victory for respect, for kindness, and for standing up when it's hard. And though the world might never be perfect, moments like this reminded her that it was still possible to make a difference. And then, something even more unexpected happened. As passengers began to disembark at the end of the flight, many of them approached Jasmine to thank her. A couple of them even apologized for not speaking up themselves. Some shared their own stories of discrimination they had faced. Others simply smiled at her with a look of gratitude. But it was a message from one passenger, a young woman in her 20s, that stuck with Jasmine the most. "Thank you for standing up," the woman said, her eyes glistening. "I've been in that same position before, and I never knew how to respond. You showed me that it's okay to speak up, that we don't have to stay silent anymore." Jasmine nodded, feeling the weight of her actions settle in. She hadn't just stood up for herself or the woman who had been attacked. She had stood up for every person who had ever felt powerless. She had reminded everyone that words have consequences, and that no one deserves to feel small. As she walked down the jetway, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She knew that this wasn't the end of the fight. There would be more moments like this, More times when people would need to choose whether to stay silent or to speak up. But for now, she had made a difference. She had sparked something in that cabin. A shift in the way people thought, the way they treated each other, and that was all she needed to know.